Isabella Cruz never imagined that singing one song would make her a prisoner of desire. When the mysterious owner of the Velvet Rose cornered her backstage, his dark eyes burning with possession, he whispered words that made her blood run cold and hot all at once. "You have a voice made for my nights, and a face made for my sins." Matteo Romano wasn't the kind of man who asked for what he wanted. He took it, and tonight he decided he wanted her. But as Isabella would soon discover, being desired by a mafia boss meant stepping into a world of danger, passion, and secrets that could destroy them both. The question wasn't whether she could escape him, it was whether she even wanted to. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Isabella Cruz stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror of her tiny bathroom, her hands gripping the edges of the sink so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The phone call had come 3 hours ago, unexpected and slightly desperate. A club downtown needed a singer for the night. Their regular performer had canceled, and somehow her demo tape had ended up in the right hands at exactly the right moment. The pay was good, better than she'd made in the last 3 months of waiting tables and singing at open mic nights combined. And the address they'd given her made her stomach flip with nervous excitement. The Velvet Rose wasn't just any club. It was the kind of place people whispered about, where the city's elite came to drink expensive wine and pretend they didn't notice the shadowy figures in the corner booths, conducting business that never saw the light of day. She pulled her dark hair back from her face, studying the way her brown eyes looked almost black in the dim lighting. At 24, Isabella had been chasing her dream of becoming a professional singer for 6 years, ever since she had left her small hometown with nothing but a suitcase and a guitar. Her mother had cried, begging her not to go to the big city where she knew no one and had no safety net. Her father had simply looked disappointed, the same expression he'd worn since she was 16, and announced she wanted to pursue music instead of becoming a nurse, like he'd hoped. But Isabella had always known she was meant for something more than the quiet, predictable life her parents had planned for her. She had songs in her soul that demanded to be heard, melodies that kept her awake at night, and a voice that her high school music teacher had once called heaven sent. The apartment around her was a testament to her struggle. Peeling wallpaper, a radiator that clanked but barely produced heat, and furniture she'd found on the street or at thrift stores. Her roommate, Jenny, worked night shifts at a hospital, and they barely saw each other, which was fine with Isabella. It meant she could practice without bothering anyone, could work through her anxiety by singing until her throat was raw and her fears were quieted. Tonight, though, no amount of practice could calm the butterflies rioting in her stomach. This was the kind of opportunity she'd been waiting for. A chance to perform for people who actually had money and connections, who might remember her name and want to hear her again. She changed into the only dress she owned that seemed appropriate for a place like the Velvet Rose, a simple black number that hugged her curves and fell just above her knees. It wasn't designer, wasn't even particularly expensive, but it was elegant in its simplicity and made her feel like someone who belonged on a stage. She paired it with heels she'd bought at a discount store, applied makeup with a careful hand, and grabbed her jacket as she headed out into the cold November night. The subway ride downtown felt longer than usual, every stop making her heart beat a little faster. She clutched her small purse against her chest and went over the set list in her mind. Jazz standards mostly, the kind of sultry, smoky songs that made people lean back in their chairs and close their eyes. She'd thrown in a few contemporary pieces with jazzy arrangements, songs about love and loss and longing that she'd reworked to fit her style. The Velvet Rose sat on a corner in the financial district, its exterior understated but unmistakably expensive. A dark red awning stretched over the entrance, and a doorman in a black suit stood guard, checking names on a list attached to a leather clipboard. Isabella approached with as much confidence as she could muster, her heels clicking against the pavement. When she gave her name, the doorman's expression didn't change, but he nodded and opened the door for her, revealing a world she'd only glimpsed in movies. The interior was all dark wood and red velvet, crystal chandeliers hanging from a ceiling painted with elaborate frescoes. The main room opened up before her, tables arranged around a small stage, a bar that stretched along one wall glittering with bottles that probably cost more than her rent. The crowd was exactly what she'd expected, Men in expensive suits, women draped in designer dresses and jewelry that caught the light with every movement. A woman in her 50s with severely pulled back blonde hair and a headset approached her immediately. "Isabella Cruz?" she asked, her voice clipped and efficient. When Isabella nodded, the woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm Margaret, the events coordinator. Follow me, we need to get you set up quickly. You go on in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Isabella's mouth went dry as she followed Margaret through the crowd, trying not to stare at the opulence around her. She caught glimpses of conversations, heard laughter that sounded too loud and too practiced, saw the way certain men commanded attention just by their presence. Margaret led her backstage, a narrow area behind heavy curtains where a microphone stand waited and a small band was tuning their instruments. The musicians looked professional, bored even, like this was just another night for them. Margaret introduced her quickly, told her they'd follow her lead, and handed her a bottle of water before disappearing back into the club. Isabella took a long drink, her hands trembling slightly. One of the musicians, an older man with kind eyes and a saxophone, gave her a reassuring smile. "First time here?" he asked, his voice rough but gentle. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "You'll do fine," he continued. "Just sing like you mean it. That's all that matters in a place like this." She wanted to ask him what he meant by a place like this, wanted to know what she'd gotten herself into, but Margaret's voice crackled through a speaker telling them 5 minutes. The band took their positions. Isabella stepped up to the microphone, and suddenly the curtains were pulling back, and she was staring out at a sea of faces illuminated by candlelight and the soft glow of the chandeliers. The spotlight hit her, and for a moment she couldn't see anything beyond its brilliant white light. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw them, all of them, watching her with varying degrees of interest. Some were still talking, barely glancing her way. Others had turned in their seats, drinks paused halfway to their lips. She wrapped her fingers around the microphone stand, felt its cool metal grounding her, and nodded to the band. The music started, a slow, sultry jazz number, and Isabella closed her eyes and let the first note pour out of her. It was pure and clear and filled with every ounce of emotion she'd been holding inside. When she opened her eyes again, the room had shifted. Conversations had stopped. Heads had turned. She had their attention now, and she wasn't going to let it go. She sang about love lost and found, about longing and desire, about the kind of passion that burned so hot it left scars. Her voice moved through the room like silk, wrapping around the audience, pulling them into the story she was telling. She'd chosen songs about heartbreak and hope, about the way love could lift you up or drag you down. And she poured everything she had into every word. Between songs, the applause was genuine, enthusiastic even. She could see people leaning toward their companions, whispering, gesturing toward the stage. It was working. She was reaching them, making them feel something. And that rush was better than any drug she could imagine. But there was one person in the room whose attention she felt more acutely than all the others combined. In a corner booth, half hidden in shadow, a man sat alone. Unlike everyone else who'd turned to watch her, he remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed, but his focus absolute. Even from the stage, she could feel the weight of his gaze, the intensity of his attention. He didn't applaud between songs, didn't move except to occasionally lift a glass of amber liquid to his lips. He just watched, and somehow that silent observation made her more nervous than the entire rest of the audience combined. She tried not to look at him, tried to focus on the people who were smiling and nodding along to the music, but her eyes kept drifting back to that corner booth, to the man whose face she couldn't quite make out, but whose presence dominated the entire room. By the time she reached her final song, Isabella's nerves had transformed into something electric. She'd never performed like this before, never felt so alive and exposed at the same time. For her closing number, she'd chosen a song about dangerous love, about falling for someone you know you should stay away from but can't resist. It seemed fitting for a place like this, for an audience that seemed to thrive on the edge between respectability and something darker. As the last note faded and the room erupted in applause, louder and more sustained than before, Isabella allowed herself a genuine smile. She'd done it. She'd performed at the Velvet Rose, and she'd killed it. Margaret appeared the moment she stepped off stage, practically vibrating with excitement. "That was incredible," she gushed, so different from her earlier efficiency. "Everyone loved you. I've already had 3 people ask when you're performing again." Isabella's heart soared. This was it. This was the break she'd been waiting for. But before she could respond, before she could even process what Margaret was saying, the woman's expression changed. It was subtle, a tightening around her eyes, a straightening of her spine. "Mr. Romano would like to see you," she said, and her voice had gone carefully neutral. "In his office. I'll take you there now." Isabella's euphoria dimmed slightly. She didn't know who Mr. Romano was, but the way Margaret said his name, with a mixture of respect and something that might have been fear, made her uneasy. "I don't understand," she said. "Who is Mr. Romano?" Margaret's eyes widened slightly, as if she couldn't believe Isabella didn't know. "He owns the club," she said simply, "and when he asks to see someone, they go." There was no room for argument in her tone, no suggestion that Isabella had a choice in the matter. So she followed, back through the club where people were still turning to look at her, down a hallway she hadn't noticed before, past doors marked private, until they reached a heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. Margaret knocked once, a sharp, efficient sound, and a voice from inside called out in Italian, smooth and deep, and touched with an accent that made something in Isabella's stomach clench. Margaret opened the door and gestured for Isabella to enter, but she didn't follow. Instead, she closed the door behind Isabella, leaving her alone in an office that was somehow more intimidating than the entire club had been. The room was large but felt intimate, lined with bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes, a massive desk dominating the center, and behind it, the man from the corner booth. Now, in the light of his office, Isabella could see him clearly, and the sight made her breath catch in her throat. He was beautiful in a way that seemed almost dangerous, like looking directly at the sun. Dark hair perfectly styled, sharp jawline, and eyes so dark they were almost black, studying her with an intensity that made her feel naked despite being fully clothed. He was probably in his mid-30s, wearing a suit that had definitely been tailored specifically for his body, and when he stood, moving with a grace that suggested coiled power, Isabella had to resist the urge to take a step back. "Miss Cruz," he said, and his voice was even more affecting up close, smooth as aged whiskey and twice as intoxicating. "Please sit." It wasn't really a request, despite the polite phrasing. Isabella moved to one of the leather chairs facing his desk and sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Matteo Romano, she was certain that's who this was, walked around his desk and leaned against it, standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at him. "You have an extraordinary voice," he continued, and the compliment should have made her happy, but the way he said it, the way he looked at her while he spoke, made it feel like something else entirely. "I found myself quite captivated." "Thank you," Isabella managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm glad you enjoyed the performance." His lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, I did more than enjoy it, Amore. I was enthralled, which is why I find myself in an unusual position." He paused, letting the silence stretch between them, and Isabella had the distinct impression he was waiting for her to ask what position that was. She didn't. She'd learned early on that giving powerful men what they wanted, even in small ways, was dangerous. So she simply waited, meeting his gaze as steadily as she could manage. After a moment, his smile widened, and this time there was genuine amusement in it. "You're not easily intimidated," he observed. "I like that." He moved then, walking slowly around her chair, and Isabella fought every instinct that told her to turn and watch him. Instead, she kept her eyes forward, her breathing even as she felt him circle behind her. "I want you to sing here regularly," he said from behind her, his voice close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her ear. "Every Friday and Saturday night. I'll pay you $10,000 per night." Isabella's mind reeled. $10,000 per night? That was more money than she made in 3 months. It was enough to move out of her terrible apartment, to quit her waitressing job, to finally focus on her music the way she'd always dreamed. It was everything she'd been working toward, handed to her on a silver platter. So why did every instinct she possessed scream at her to refuse? That's very generous, she said carefully, but I'll need time to think about it. Matteo laughed, a low, rich sound that shouldn't have been as appealing as it was. He came around to face her again, this time sitting on the edge of his desk, so they were almost at eye level. Most people would have agreed immediately, he said, tilting his head as he studied her. What makes you hesitate? Isabella met his gaze directly. I don't even know you, she said. You could be a serial killer for all I know. The words were out before she could stop them, and for a moment, the room went so silent she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then Matteo threw his head back and laughed. Really laughed, and the sound transformed his entire face, making him look younger and somehow even more dangerous. A serial killer, he repeated, still chuckling. That's a new one. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. I'm not a serial killer, Isabella. May I call you Isabella? She nodded, not trusting her voice. I'm a businessman, he continued. Admittedly, I deal in ventures that some might consider morally ambiguous, but I'm not in the habit of murdering people. The way he said it, so casual and matter-of-fact, should have reassured her. Instead, it confirmed what she'd suspected the moment she walked into this place. Matteo Romano wasn't just a club owner, he was something else, something darker, and getting involved with him would be stepping into a world she didn't understand and couldn't control. I appreciate the offer, she said, standing up because she needed to feel less vulnerable, needed to not be looking up at him anymore. But I need to think about it. Can I give you my answer in a few days? Matteo stood as well, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with something electric. You can, he said softly, but I should warn you, Isabella, I'm not a patient man, and when I want something, I tend to get it. He reached out, and before she could react, his fingers were brushing against her cheek, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was gentle, almost tender, but it sent a shiver down her spine. You have a voice made for my nights, he murmured, his eyes locked on hers. And a face made for my sins. Isabella's breath caught, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. Every rational part of her brain screamed at her to step back, to put distance between them, to run out of this office and never look back. But she couldn't move. She was caught in his gaze, trapped by the intensity of whatever this was between them. And when he leaned closer, so close she could smell his cologne, expensive and masculine and intoxicating, she didn't pull away. Think about my offer, he whispered, his lips so close to hers she could feel the words. But don't think too long. I'd hate for someone else to discover you before I've had a chance to make you mine. Then he stepped back, the spell broken, and Isabella found she could breathe again. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and turned toward the door. Her legs felt shaky, her entire body trembling with an adrenaline crash she didn't fully understand. She'd almost reached the exit when his voice stopped her. Isabella, she turned back, her hand on the doorknob. Matteo was standing behind his desk now, his expression unreadable. You were magnificent tonight, he said. And this time the compliment was simple, sincere. Whatever you decide, you should know that. She managed a small smile, whispered a thank you, and fled. The club felt different as she made her way back through it. The crowd was thinning, the night winding down, but people still watched her as she passed. Some nodded, others raised their glasses in a small salute. Margaret caught her near the entrance, pressing an envelope into her hands. Your payment for tonight, she explained, and Mr. Romano's contact information in case you'd like to discuss his offer. Isabella took the envelope, feeling the weight of cash inside, more money than she'd ever been paid for a single performance. She should have felt ecstatic. Instead, she felt like she'd just made a deal with the devil and hadn't even realized it until it was too late. The subway ride home passed in a blur. Isabella sat in the mostly empty car, the envelope clutched in her hands, and tried to process what had just happened. The performance had been incredible, exactly the kind of success she'd dreamed of. The money was more than she'd hoped for, and the offer Matteo had made would change her life completely. But there was something about him, about the way he'd looked at her, the things he'd said, that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. One step forward and she'd be flying, but she wasn't sure if she'd soar or fall. When she finally made it back to her apartment, Jenny was just getting home from her shift, looking exhausted in her scrubs. "How is the gig?" she asked, dropping her bag by the door. Isabella opened the envelope and pulled out the cash, counting it quickly. $500 for one night of work. She handed 2 bills to Jenny. "For rent," she said. "I'm caught up now." Jenny's eyes widened as she took the money. "That good, huh?" Isabella thought about Matteo's office, about the way he'd touched her face, about the promise and threat wrapped up in his words. "Yeah," she said slowly, "that good." But as she lay in bed that night, staring at her ceiling and replaying every moment of the evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that good wasn't the right word at all. Complicated, maybe. Dangerous, definitely. Life-changing, absolutely. But good? She wasn't sure yet. The next 3 days passed in a haze of indecision. Isabella went to her waitressing job, poured coffee and delivered plates, and smiled at customers who barely saw her. And the entire time her mind was somewhere else. She kept pulling out the card Margaret had given her, Matteo's contact information embossed on expensive cardstock, and staring at it like it might give her answers. Jenny noticed her distraction, asking repeatedly what was wrong, but Isabella didn't know how to explain. How could she tell her roommate that a dangerous, beautiful man had offered her everything she'd ever wanted, and the only price seemed to be her peace of mind? On the 3rd day, she called her mother, something she only did when she was truly desperate for guidance. "Mija," her mother answered, her voice warm with surprise. "It's so good to hear from you. Is everything okay?" Isabella curled up on her bed, the phone pressed to her ear, and for a moment she was 16 again, asking her mother for advice about boys and school and whether her dreams were worth chasing. "Mama," she said softly, "if someone offered you everything you'd ever wanted, but you weren't sure if you could trust them, what would you do?" Her mother was quiet for a long moment. "Is this about a man?" she finally asked, her tone knowing. Isabella closed her eyes. "Maybe." Another pause. "Amore, I can't tell you what to do. You're a grown woman, and you've always been smart about these things. But I will say this. If something feels too good to be true, you need to ask yourself why. What does this person get out of giving you what you want?" That was the question, wasn't it? What did Matteo Romano get out of paying her obscene amounts of money to sing at his club? She was talented, she knew that. But there were plenty of talented singers in the city. Why her? Why was he so insistent? After she hung up with her mother, Isabella made her decision. She would take the job, but she would be smart about it. She would keep her distance from Matteo, would treat this as purely professional, would save every penny so that when it inevitably fell apart, she'd have options. It was a plan that made sense, that felt safe, and she clung to it like a lifeline. She texted the number on the card, keeping her message brief and professional. She would accept his offer for Friday and Saturday nights, standard contract terms, payment upon performance. The response came within minutes, and she could practically hear the satisfaction in the typed words. "Excellent. See you Friday at 8. Dress accordingly." Friday arrived faster than Isabella had anticipated. She spent the day in a state of nervous energy, trying on every piece of clothing she owned and finding all of it lacking. Finally, frustrated and running out of time, she did something she'd never done before. She took $200 of the money from her first performance and went shopping. The boutique she found was small, but clearly catered to women who had money, and the sales associate who approached her looked skeptical until Isabella explained what she needed. "I'm performing at the Velvet Rose," she said, "and I need something that will fit the atmosphere." The woman's entire demeanor changed. Suddenly she was pulling dresses, suggesting styles, treating Isabella like she mattered. The dress she finally chose was deep emerald green, the color making her skin glow and her eyes look lighter. It had a fitted bodice and a skirt that flowed when she moved, elegant and sophisticated without being revealing. With new shoes and a simple gold necklace, she looked like someone who belonged in Matteo's world. The performance that Friday was even better than the first. Isabella had spent the week practicing, adding new songs to her repertoire, working with the band to create arrangements that showcased her voice. The crowd loved her, and this time she could feel their anticipation. Could see people who had been there the previous week bringing friends, pointing her out, leaning forward in their seats from the first note. It was intoxicating, this feeling of being wanted, of being appreciated for her talent. But through it all, she was acutely aware of Matteo's presence. He sat in the same corner booth, alone again, watching her with that same intense focus. This time she didn't try to avoid looking at him. Instead, she sang to him, let her voice wrap around him specifically, and watched the way his expression shifted, the way his jaw tightened and his fingers gripped his glass just a little harder. After the performance, Margaret found her backstage immediately. "Mr. Romano requests your presence in his office," she said. And this time, there was something almost apologetic in her tone. Isabella had expected this, had prepared herself for it, but her heart still raced as she followed the familiar path down the hallway. This time, when she entered his office, Matteo didn't make her wait. He stood the moment she walked in, moving around his desk with that predatory grace that made her pulse quicken. "You were even better tonight," he said, and there was something in his voice, something hungry and appreciative that made her skin flush. "Thank you," she replied, staying near the door, maintaining distance. "I'm glad you're pleased." He noticed her position, noticed the way she held herself apart, and his smile was knowing. "You're afraid of me," he observed, not like it bothered him, more like it was an interesting fact. "I'm cautious," Isabella corrected. "There's a difference." Matteo laughed. That same rich sound that did dangerous things to her composure. "Fair enough," he said. He moved to a cabinet along the wall and pulled out a bottle of wine, expensive looking, and 2 glasses. "Will you join me for a drink?" "Just a drink, Isabella. I promise I don't bite unless asked." She should have said no. Everything about this situation screamed danger. But she found herself nodding, found herself moving further into the room and accepting the glass he poured for her. The wine was incredible, smooth and complex, and she took a small sip while Matteo watched her over the rim of his own glass. "Tell me about yourself," he said, settling into one of the leather chairs and gesturing for her to take the other. "Where are you from? How did you end up singing in my club?" It was such a normal question, the kind of thing people asked on first dates, and the incongruity of it in this setting almost made her laugh. But she answered, telling him about her small hometown, her parents' disappointment, her years of struggle in the city. She told him about open mic nights and demo tapes, and the constant rejection that came with chasing an impossible dream. Matteo listened, really listened, his attention never wavering from her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "Your parents were wrong," he finally said. "Some people are meant for ordinary lives. You're not one of them." The certainty in his voice, the way he said it like it was simple fact rather than opinion, made something in Isabella's chest tighten. "You don't know me well enough to say that," she said softly. His eyes met hers, dark and intense. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you walked into my club with more courage than most of my employees will ever have. I know you didn't immediately accept my offer even though you clearly need the money. I know you're sitting here now, drinking wine with me, even though every instinct you have is telling you to run." He stood, setting his glass down, and moved toward her. Isabella's breath caught as he stopped in front of her chair, close enough to touch but not touching. "I know," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "that when you sing, you pour your entire soul into every note. That kind of passion, that kind of fearlessness, is rare, and I collect rare things, Isabella." She should have been offended by that, by being referred to as a thing to be collected. Instead, she found herself setting down her own glass and standing, bringing them almost chest to chest. "I'm not a possession," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. "I'm not something you can own." Matteo's smile was slow and dangerous. "No," he agreed, "you're not. But you are something I want, and I always get what I want, eventually." His hand came up, fingers trailing along her jaw in a touch so light it almost wasn't there. "The question is, how long will you make me wait?" Isabella's breath caught, her body responding to his touch in ways that terrified her. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the desire in his eyes, and knew that if she stayed in this room much longer, something would happen that she wasn't ready for. "I should go," she whispered, but she didn't move. Matteo leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. You should, he agreed. But you won't? Not yet. He was right, and that was the most dangerous part. She stood there, caught in whatever this was between them, unable to move forward or pull away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Matteo stepped back. Go home, Isabella, he said, his voice rough. While I still have the control to let you. She didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her purse and fled, the sound of his low laughter following her down the hallway. That night, she lay awake until dawn, her body still humming with unfulfilled desire, her mind racing with questions she didn't have answers for. What was she doing? Who was Matteo Romano really? And why couldn't she stop thinking about the way his fingers had felt against her skin? The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. Every Friday and Saturday, Isabella performed at the Velvet Rose. Every night, the crowd grew larger, more enthusiastic. She was becoming known, people coming specifically to hear her sing. Margaret told her that reservations had doubled on her performance nights, that people were calling weeks in advance to ensure they had tables. The money was everything Matteo had promised. Each night, Margaret handed her an envelope with $10,000 in cash, more money than Isabella had ever imagined having. She opened a bank account, started saving, moved out of her terrible apartment into a modest but clean studio in a better neighborhood. She quit her waitressing job, bought new clothes, could afford to eat meals that didn't come from a dollar menu. But the cost of all this prosperity was the growing tension between her and Matteo. Every night after her performance, he called her to his office. Sometimes they talked, his questions about her life and dreams surprisingly thoughtful. Other times they simply sat in silence, drinking wine, the air between them charged with unspoken desire. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give. But the wanting was there in every glance, every casual touch that lasted just a moment too long. Isabella found herself looking forward to those late-night meetings as much as she dreaded them. Matteo was unlike anyone she'd ever met, complex and dangerous, but also funny and surprisingly thoughtful. He remembered details she'd mentioned in passing, asked about her mother, wanted to know about the songs she was writing. Because she had started writing again, for the first time in years, the music poured out of her, inspired by the conflicting emotions Matteo stirred in her. Songs about desire and danger, about the thrill of standing too close to the fire, about wanting something you knew would burn you. She didn't share them with him, not yet, but she could feel them building, demanding to be heard. One Saturday night in late December, 6 weeks after she'd started performing at the Velvet Rose, everything changed. The club was hosting a Christmas party, the decorations elegant and understated, the crowd even more elite than usual. Isabella had prepared a special set list, holiday classics reimagined with jazzy arrangements, and the audience loved it. She was midway through her set when she noticed something different about Matteo's booth. He wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him, beautiful in a cold, calculated way, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her dress designer and expensive. She was leaning toward Matteo, her hand on his arm, her body language screaming intimacy and possession. Something hot and ugly twisted in Isabella's stomach, something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. She stumbled over a lyric, caught herself, but the damage was done. Her concentration was shot. She finished the song, forced a smile, and announced she was taking a short break. Backstage, she gripped the edge of a table and tried to steady her breathing. What was wrong with her? She had no claim on Matteo, no right to feel betrayed by the sight of him with another woman. They weren't together, weren't anything except employer and employee who happened to have some tension between them. But God, it hurt. It hurt in a way that made her realize just how deeply she'd fallen without even meaning to. She was still trying to compose herself when the curtain behind her moved and Matteo stepped through. He looked furious, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than if he'd yelled. Isabella straightened, drawing on every ounce of pride she possessed. "I don't know what you mean," she said coolly. "I'm taking a break, as is my right according to our agreement." Matteo moved closer, crowding her against the table. "You stumbled," he said. "You never stumble. What happened?" Isabella lifted her chin, meeting his gaze defiantly. Maybe I was distracted by the fact that my employer seems to be otherwise occupied tonight. I'd hate to intrude on your evening. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like triumph. You're jealous, he said, and he sounded pleased about it. Isabella's face flamed. I'm not jealous, she snapped. I'm simply acknowledging reality. You clearly have other interests, so perhaps we should keep our relationship strictly professional from now on. Matteo laughed, the sound sharp. Our relationship has never been strictly professional, Amore, and you know it. He reached out, his hands gripping her waist, pulling her against him. That woman out there is a business associate, nothing more. She means nothing to me. Isabella tried to pull away, but his grip was firm, not painful, but unbreakable. I don't care who she is, she said, hating the tremor in her voice. Yes, Matteo said softly, his face so close to hers she could feel his breath on her lips. You do. You care very much, just as I would care if I saw another man touching you, just as I would want to break the fingers of anyone who dared put their hands on what's mine. Isabella's breath caught. I'm not yours, she whispered. But even to her own ears it sounded like a question rather than a statement. Matteo's smile was predatory. Aren't you? He murmured. Haven't you been mine since the moment you stepped onto my stage and I heard that voice? Haven't you been thinking about me every night the way I've been thinking about you? He was right, and they both knew it. Isabella had been his from that first night, had been caught in whatever web he'd spun around her, and fighting it was becoming impossible. This is insane, she whispered. You're dangerous. You're involved in things I don't understand. I should run as far away from you as I can. But you won't, Matteo said, his voice rough with desire. Because you feel this too, this thing between us. Because when you sing, you're singing to me. Because you come to my office every night, hoping I'll finally stop being a gentleman and take what we both won. Isabella's resolve crumbled. She surged forward, closing the distance between them, and kissed him. It was fierce and desperate, and everything she'd been denying herself for weeks. Matteo responded immediately, one hand tangling in her hair, the other pressing against the small of her back, holding her against him like he'd never let her go. The kiss was fire and hunger and 6 weeks of restrained desire finally unleashed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matteo rested his forehead against hers. Say yes, he whispered. Say you're mine. Isabella knew this was a turning point, knew that once she said the words, there would be no going back. But looking into his eyes, seeing the raw need there, feeling the way her own body responded to his touch, she couldn't deny it anymore. Yes, she breathed. I'm yours. The smile that spread across Matteo's face was triumphant and tender all at once. Good, he said, and kissed her again, softer this time, like a promise. Now go finish your set. Show them all who you belong to. Isabella returned to the stage in a daze, her lips still tingling, her body humming with awakened desire. When she looked at Matteo's booth, the blonde woman was gone, and he sat alone, watching her with undisguised possession. She sang the rest of her set differently that night. Every song a private conversation between them, every note laden with promise and heat. After the performance, Matteo didn't summon her to his office. Instead, he found her backstage, took her hand without a word, and led her out a back entrance to where a sleek black car waited. The driver didn't ask questions, simply drove them through the city streets, while Matteo sat beside her, his hand covering hers, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. They ended up at a penthouse apartment that overlooked the city, all glass and modern luxury, and Isabella knew without asking that this was his home. I want to do this right, Matteo said as they stood in his living room, the city lights glittering below them. I want to take you to dinner, court you properly, show you that I can be more than just the dangerous man you think I am. Isabella moved closer to him, her hands sliding up his chest. I don't want proper, she said. I don't want slow. I've spent 6 weeks wanting you, and I'm done waiting. Something dark and hungry flashed in Matteo's eyes. Are you sure? He asked, his voice strained with the effort of holding back. Once we cross this line, Tesoro, there's no going back. You'll be mine in every way, and I don't share. I don't let go. Isabella answered by pulling his head down to hers, kissing him with all the pent-up longing she'd been carrying. Matteo groaned against her lips, his control finally snapping, and swept her up into his arms. The night that followed was everything Isabella had dreamed of and more. Matteo was passionate and demanding, but also surprisingly tender, worshipping her body like she was something precious. He learned every sound she made, every place that made her gasp. And when they finally came together, it felt like something clicking into place, like two pieces of a puzzle that had been searching for each other. Afterward, as they lay tangled in his sheets, Matteo traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice serious. Isabella propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him. "I already know you're not just a club owner," she said softly. "I'm not stupid, Matteo. I know there's more to what you do." He studied her face, seeming to search for judgment or fear. When he found neither, he let out a long breath. "My family has been in certain businesses for 3 generations," he said carefully. "Import, export, protection services. We operate in gray areas, Isabella. What I do isn't always legal, and it's certainly not always safe." She should have been scared. Any rational person would have been. Instead, she found herself asking, "Have you ever hurt anyone who didn't deserve it?" Matteo's expression was grave. "No," he said firmly. "I have rules, lines I don't cross. I don't deal in drugs or human trafficking. I don't hurt innocents, but I won't lie to you, Amore. I've done things that would make you see me differently if you knew all the details." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, processing this. "My father always told me I had terrible judgment when it came to men," she finally said. Looks like he was right. Matteo tensed beneath her, and she could see him preparing for her to leave, to reject him. Instead, she leaned down and kissed him softly. "But I don't care," she whispered against his lips. "Maybe that makes me crazy, but I don't care. I want this. I want you, whatever that means." The relief in his eyes was palpable, and he pulled her down against his chest, holding her tight. "You have no idea what you do to me," he murmured into her hair. "I've never felt this way about anyone. You've gotten under my skin, Isabella Cruz, and I don't think I could let you go even if I wanted to." They spent the rest of the night talking, sharing stories and secrets, building something that felt dangerously like the beginning of love. When Isabella finally fell asleep in his arms as dawn broke over the city, she felt safer than she had in years, despite knowing she'd just committed herself to the most dangerous man she'd ever met. The weeks that followed were a blur of passion and discovery. Matteo was surprisingly romantic, sending flowers to her apartment, taking her to expensive restaurants, introducing her to his world in carefully measured doses. Isabella learned that the Velvet Rose was just one of several legitimate businesses Matteo operated. He owned restaurants, a hotel, various real estate holdings. But beneath it all was the family business, the network of connections and obligations that came with being a Romano. She met some of his associates, men with hard eyes who treated Matteo with a mixture of respect and fear. She saw glimpses of the man he became in business, cold and calculating and absolutely ruthless. But with her, he was different. With her, he was tender and attentive, surprisingly playful, genuinely interested in her thoughts and dreams. He encouraged her music, listening to her new songs with real appreciation, suggesting she record a demo with professional equipment. When she hesitated, worried about the cost, he simply arranged it, brushing off her protests about not wanting his money. "What's mine is yours," he told her. "Get used to it." It should have bothered her, this casual display of wealth and power. Instead, Isabella found herself adapting to it, accepting the gifts he lavished on her, the security his presence provided. For the first time in her life, she wasn't struggling, wasn't worried about making rent or whether she could afford to eat. She could focus entirely on her music, and the results were immediate. Her performances at the Velvet Rose became legendary. People called weeks in advance for reservations, and Matteo had to turn away more guests than he accepted. Other clubs started calling, offering her gigs, but Matteo made it clear she was exclusive to his venue. "I don't share," he reminded her, and though he said it with a smile, there was steel underneath. It might have become a problem if Isabella had wanted to perform elsewhere, but she didn't. Everything she needed was right here, in this club, singing for audiences who adored her, and a man who looked at her like she hung the moon. But paradise never lasts, and Isabella should have known their bubble of happiness couldn't remain unbroken forever. The first crack appeared on a Friday night in late January. Isabella was preparing for her performance when Margaret came backstage, her face pale and worried. "Mr. Romano wants to see you immediately," she said, and there was something in her tone that made Isabella's stomach drop. She found Matteo in his office, pacing like a caged animal, his expression darker than she'd ever seen it. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. Matteo turned to her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that might have been fear. "I need you to not perform tonight," he said, without preamble. "I need you to go home, pack a bag, and wait for my call." Isabella's heart started to race. "Matteo, you're scaring me. What's happening?" He crossed to her, taking her face in his hands. "There are some people coming to the club tonight. People from a rival family who have an interest in destabilizing my operations. I don't want you anywhere near this place when they arrive." Isabella's mind reeled. "This is about your business," she said slowly. "The illegal parts." Matteo's jaw tightened. "Yes," he admitted. "There's been tension building for months. Tonight it might come to a head, and I need to know you're safe." For the first time since she'd committed to him, Isabella felt real fear, not for herself, but for Matteo. "What are they going to do?" she asked. "Are you in danger?" His smile was grim. "I can handle myself, Amore, but I can't focus on what needs to be done if I'm worried about you. Please, do as I ask." Every instinct Isabella had screamed at her to stay, to not leave him to face whatever this was alone. But she could see the resolve in his eyes, knew he wouldn't budge on this. "Okay," she agreed reluctantly. "But you call me as soon as it's over. Promise me." Matteo pulled her against him, kissing her with an intensity that felt like goodbye. "I promise," he whispered. "Now go." Isabella went, but she didn't go far. She couldn't just abandon him, couldn't sit in her apartment wondering if he was okay. Instead, she went to a cafe across the street from the Velvet Rose, ordered coffee she didn't drink, and watched the club's entrance. As the evening wore on, she saw men arriving, expensive suits and hard faces, moving with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they were dangerous. Her phone rang around 9, a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, a voice she'd heard before at the club, one of Matteo's associates, spoke urgently. "Miss Cruz, you need to get inside. Now, Mr. Romano needs you." Isabella's blood went cold. "What's happened? Is he hurt?" "Just come," the man said, and disconnected. Isabella ran across the street, her heart in her throat. The doorman let her in immediately, his face grim, and she rushed through the club toward Matteo's office. The main room was in chaos, tables overturned, glasses shattered, and people clearing out quickly. Whatever had happened here, it had been bad. She burst into Matteo's office to find him standing near his desk, his suit jacket gone, his shirt torn and blood-stained. Her gasp brought his head up, and the expression on his face was a mixture of anger and resignation. "I told you to go home," he said, his voice rough. Isabella ignored that, crossing to him quickly and examining the blood. "Are you hurt? Is this your blood?" "Some of it," he admitted. "It's not serious." But when she pushed aside his torn shirt, she found a nasty gash across his ribs that was still bleeding. "This needs stitches," she said, her training from growing up with a nurse father kicking in. "You need to go to a hospital." Matteo shook his head. "No hospitals, too many questions. I have someone who handles this sort of thing." As if on cue, an older man with a medical bag entered the office. He took one look at Matteo and sighed. "Again, boss? That's the third time this month." Isabella watched in horror as the man, who Matteo introduced as Dr. Russo, cleaned and stitched the wound without anesthetic, while Matteo barely flinched. This was his world, she realized. This violence, this danger, this casual acceptance of injury. And she'd just walked right into the middle of it. When Dr. Russo finished and left, Isabella sank into a chair, her legs shaking. "Tell me what happened," she demanded. Matteo poured himself a drink, winced as the movement pulled his stitches, and downed it in one swallow. The Marchesi family has been trying to move into my territory for months, he explained. Tonight they made their play, sent men to the club to threaten my customers, to show they could touch what's mine. We had words. It got physical. Isabella looked at the blood on the floor, on his clothes, and felt sick. Someone could have been killed, she whispered. You could have been killed. Matteo moved to kneel in front of her, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. This is who I am, Isabella. This is the life I lead. I tried to protect you from it, but maybe that was foolish. Maybe you need to see the truth of what being with me means. She looked into his eyes, saw the vulnerability there beneath the hardness, and knew he was giving her an out. He was showing her the ugliest part of his world and waiting for her to run. The smart thing would be to do exactly that, to walk away before she got in any deeper. But Isabella had never been good at doing the smart thing. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly, but you need to promise me something. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll do whatever it takes to stay safe, because I can't lose you, Matteo. I've only just found you. The relief in his expression was immediate and intense. He pulled her down off the chair and into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. I promise, he murmured against her hair. I'll be careful. I'll end this war before it really begins. I'll do whatever it takes to come home to you every night. It was a promise he tried his best to keep. But the conflict with the Marchesi family escalated over the following weeks. There were more incidents, more late-night calls, more times when Isabella waited anxiously for Matteo to check in and let her know he was all right. She stopped performing at the Velvet Rose temporarily, both for her safety and because Matteo couldn't focus on business when he was worried about her. Instead, she spent her days writing music, channeling her fear and love into songs that grew increasingly desperate and passionate. And she spent her nights at Matteo's penthouse, waiting for him to come home, cleaning his wounds when he had them, holding him when the weight of what he did became too much to bear alone. She learned the names of his enemies, the structure of his organization, the delicate balance of power that kept the city's underworld in check. She met Matteo's father, Giovanni Romano, a silver-haired man in his 60s, who looked at her with shrewd eyes and told his son, "This one is different. Don't let her go." She met Matteo's sister, Sofia, who ran the legitimate side of the family business, and welcomed Isabella with open arms, thrilled her brother had finally found someone who could handle his intensity. Slowly, carefully, Isabella was absorbed into Matteo's world, and to her surprise, she fit. The other wives and girlfriends of his associates accepted her, teaching her the unspoken rules of their world. Don't ask questions about business. Always support your man publicly. Never show fear to outsiders. It should have felt wrong, being part of this life. Instead, it felt like coming home. Then came the night that changed everything. It was early March, 3 months after Isabella had first walked into the Velvet Rose, and Matteo had called to say he'd be late. There was a meeting with the Marcheses to negotiate a truce. Isabella waited at the penthouse, trying to distract herself with television, with music, with anything that would quiet the anxiety gnawing at her gut. When her phone finally rang at 2 a.m, she answered before the first ring finished. But it wasn't Matteo's voice she heard. It was Sofia, and she was crying. "Isabella, you need to come to St. Mary's Hospital right now," she said, her words tumbling over each other. There was a shooting at the meeting. Matteo's been hurt. The world tilted sideways. Isabella was moving before she even registered the decision, grabbing her purse, running for the door. She caught a cab, gave the driver extra money to speed, and spent the entire ride praying to a God she'd stopped believing in years ago. Please, she thought, please don't take him from me, not now. Not when I've just learned what it means to love someone this much. The hospital was chaos when she arrived. Men in suits filled the waiting room, all of Matteo's associates and their families. Sofia found her immediately, pulling her into a tight hug. "He's in surgery," she explained, her voice shaking. "He was shot twice, once in the shoulder and once in the chest. They don't know yet if the chest wound hit anything vital." Isabella felt like she was going to be sick. "What happened?" she managed to ask. Sofia's expression hardened. "It was a setup. The Marcheses never intended to negotiate. They wanted to end this by ending Matteo." The hours that followed were the longest of Isabella's life. She sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair surrounded by dangerous men who looked lost without their leader, and waited. Sophia stayed with her, holding her hand, both of them silent with fear. When a doctor finally emerged, still in his surgical scrubs, everyone stood at once. He made it through surgery, the doctor said. And Isabella's knees nearly buckled with relief. The shoulder wound was clean, but the chest shot was more complicated. We had to repair damage to his lung. He lost a lot of blood, but he's stable now. He's going to make it. Isabella started to cry, great heaving sobs of relief that she couldn't control. Sophia pulled her close, crying too. And around them the men were shaking hands, clapping each other on the back, the tension draining from the room. "Can I see him?" Isabella asked when she could speak again. The doctor hesitated. "He's in recovery, heavily sedated. Only family right now." Before Isabella could argue, Sophia stepped forward. "She's his fiancée," she said firmly. "That makes her family." It was a lie. Isabella and Matteo weren't engaged, but no one questioned it. The doctor nodded and led Isabella down a series of hallways to a room where Matteo lay unconscious, hooked up to machines that beeped and whirred. He looked pale, fragile in a way she'd never seen him, and the sight of him like this broke something inside her. She moved to his bedside, taking his hand carefully, mindful of the IV. "I'm here," she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her. "I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere. You promised you'd be careful, you jerk. You promised you'd come home to me." She stayed there all night, refusing to leave even when nurses tried to shoo her out. When morning came and Matteo's eyes finally fluttered open, hazy with drugs and pain, the first thing he saw was her face. "Isabella," he rasped, his voice rough. "You're here." "Of course I'm here," she said, squeezing his hand gently. "Where else would I be?" A weak smile crossed his face. "You should have run," he said. "Smart women run from men like me." Isabella leaned down, pressing her forehead to his carefully. "Good thing I never claimed to be smart then," she whispered. Matteo's recovery was slow and painful. He chafed at being stuck in a hospital bed, at being weak and vulnerable. The Marchesi family, seeing him incapacitated, tried to make moves on his territory. His associates handled it, more viciously than Matteo might have. And by the time he was released from the hospital 2 weeks later, the Marcheses had been completely pushed out of the city. The war was over, won in Matteo's absence, by men who were terrified of losing their boss. Isabella had moved into the penthouse fully during his hospitalization, and when he came home, she was there to help him heal. She changed his bandages, reminded him to take his medication, forced him to rest when he wanted to go back to work too soon. She sang to him on the nights when the pain kept him awake, her voice soothing him in ways the drugs couldn't. And slowly, painfully, he healed. One night in early April, as they sat on his balcony watching the sun set over the city, Matteo turned to her with an expression she couldn't read. "Sophia told people you were my fiancé at the hospital," he said. Isabella felt her cheeks heat. "She was trying to help," she explained, "so I could see you. I'm sorry if that was too presumptuous." Matteo caught her hand, pulling her closer. "It wasn't presumptuous," he said softly. "It was perfect, which is why I want to make it true." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, Isabella gasped. The ring inside was stunning, a simple but perfect diamond that caught the dying light and threw rainbows across the balcony. "I was going to do this properly," Matteo said, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked nervous. "Take you somewhere romantic. Get down on one knee, give you the whole production. But I've never been good at waiting, and I nearly died without you knowing how much you mean to me. So I'm asking now, here, where it's just us. Isabella Cruz, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, share my life, accept all the danger and complications that come with loving me?" Isabella's heart felt too big for her chest. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Matteo slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, then pulled her into his lap, kissing her with all the passion and promise of the life they'd built together. The wedding took place 3 months later, in July, at a private estate outside the city. It was small by Romano family standards, only about 200 people, a mix of family and close associates. Isabella's parents came, her mother crying throughout the entire ceremony. her father looking uncomfortable in his suit, but trying his best to be happy for his daughter. Matteo had met them the week before, had been charming and respectful, and while Isabella's father still had reservations about his new son-in-law, he could see how much Matteo loved Isabella, and that counted for something. Isabella wore a dress that made her feel like a princess, simple and elegant with lace sleeves and a long train. When she walked down the aisle on her father's arm and saw Matteo waiting at the altar, looking devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo, she knew she'd made the right choice. Every danger, every complication, every moment of fear had been worth it to arrive at this moment. The ceremony was traditional, a Catholic mass officiated by a priest who'd known the Romano family for years. When Matteo slipped the wedding band onto Isabella's finger, his voice was steady and sure as he recited his vows. "With this ring, I thee wed. With my body, I thee worship. And with all my worldly goods, I thee endow." Then it was Isabella's turn, and she looked into his dark eyes and spoke from her heart. "I promise to love you through danger and safety, through darkness and light. I promise to stand by your side, to support your dreams, to build a life with you that honors both of us. I promise to sing for you, only for you, for as long as we both shall live." There wasn't a dry eye in the church when the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife. The reception was held at the same estate, under strings of lights as the sun set and stars emerged overhead. There was music and dancing, incredible food, and more champagne than Isabella had ever seen in her life. But the best moment came when it was time for the bride and groom's first dance. The band started playing, but Matteo held up a hand, stopping them. "My wife," he said, and Isabella's heart fluttered at the word, "has given me many gifts. Her love, her courage, her willingness to accept all of me. But the greatest gift has been her voice. And tonight, on our wedding day, I want to hear her sing." He nodded to the band, who began playing the instrumental arrangement of one of Isabella's original songs, one she'd written about falling in love with a dangerous man. The crowd went silent as Isabella took the microphone. And then she sang. She sang about finding love in unexpected places, about the thrill of danger mixed with devotion, about choosing passion over safety. She sang about Matteo, pouring every ounce of love she felt into every note, and when she finished, there wasn't a sound except for his footsteps as he crossed to her. He took the microphone from her hands, set it aside, and pulled her into his arms. "Sing for me, Amore," he whispered against her hair, repeating the words he'd said to her so many times. "Always and forever, sing for me." The years that followed were not always easy. Being married to a man like Matteo came with challenges Isabella had never imagined. There were threats from rivals, investigations from law enforcement, constant security concerns. But there were also moments of profound joy. Isabella resumed performing at the Velvet Rose, now billed as Isabella Romano, and her popularity only grew. She recorded an album that sold well, did a small tour of select cities, always with Matteo's security team shadowing her. She used her growing platform to champion other aspiring artists, started a scholarship fund for young musicians from underprivileged backgrounds. Matteo slowly transitioned more of the family business to legitimate ventures, partly because he was getting older, and partly because he wanted to give Isabella a life that didn't involve constantly looking over their shoulders. When their first child was born, a daughter they named Lucia after Matteo's mother, Isabella saw a side of her husband she'd never witnessed before. He was tender with their baby, careful and devoted, and watching him cradle their daughter while singing Italian lullabies made Isabella fall in love with him all over again. They had 2 more children after Lucia, twin boys named Marco and Giovanni, and their home filled with the chaos and joy of family life. Isabella balanced her career with motherhood, performing less frequently but more meaningfully, each concert a special event that people treasured. And through it all, Matteo was her constant. He was there for every milestone, every performance, every late-night feeding and early morning school drop-off. He proved that a man could be dangerous and devoted, powerful and tender, ruthless in business, and gentle with those he loved. On their 10th anniversary, Matteo took Isabella back to the Velvet Rose, which they still owned though it was now run by managers. The club was closed for the night, empty except for the two of them and the same band that had played the night they met. "Do you remember the first time you sang here?" Matteo asked as they stood on the empty stage, his arms around her waist. Isabella smiled, leaning back against him. "I remember being terrified," she said. "I remember looking out at the crowd and seeing you in that corner booth, watching me like I was the only person in the room." Matteo pressed a kiss to her temple. "You were the only person in the room," he murmured. "From that first note, you owned my heart, even though I didn't know it yet." Isabella turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd changed her entire life. He had some gray at his temples now, lines around his eyes from laughter and worry, but he was still the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "I love you," she said simply. "I know I tell you that every day, but I need you to really hear it. You gave me everything I ever dreamed of and so much more. You gave me a life worth singing about." Matteo cupped her face in his hands, his touch as gentle as it had been that first night in his office when he'd tucked her hair behind her ear. "And you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me something I never thought I'd have. A home, a family, a reason to be better than I was. You saw past the danger to the man beneath, and you loved him anyway. That's a gift I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve." They kissed then, slow and sweet, and filled with a decade of shared memories and dreams. And when they finally pulled apart, Matteo nodded to the band, and they began to play. It was the same song Isabella had sung on that first night, about dangerous love and beautiful risks. And as her voice filled the empty club, Matteo held her close and they swayed together in the dim light. This was where their story had begun, in this club, on this stage, with her voice calling to something in his soul he hadn't known was waiting to be found. And now, 10 years and 3 children and countless adventures later, they were still here, still together, still finding new ways to love each other. Isabella thought about that terrified girl who'd walked into the Velvet Rose all those years ago, desperate for a break and willing to take any opportunity that came her way. She'd had no idea that opportunity would come in the form of a dangerous, beautiful man who would turn her entire world upside down. She'd had no idea that saying yes to one performance would lead to saying yes to a life she'd never imagined. But she wouldn't change a single moment. Every risk had been worth it. Every moment of fear had been balanced by a moment of joy. Every danger had been offset by the safety she felt in Matteo's arms. This was her life now, her beautiful, complicated, passionate life, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. As the song ended and the last notes faded into silence, Matteo whispered in her ear the words he'd said to her so many times over the years. "Sing for me, Amore." And Isabella smiled, her heart full to bursting, and replied the same way she always did. "Always and forever, my love. Always and forever."